The wind over Britain carried more than rain that night. It carried whispers of a plan so strange, so daring, that even the men who flew the skies for a living found it hard to believe. A plan where bombers would not return home. A plan to strike deep into the Reich and then vanish into the east, into the heart of the Soviet Union. They called it Operation Frantic. A bridge of steel and courage stretched across Europe, from the cloudy skies of England to the endless plains of Ukraine. It was a mission that would test not only engines and endurance, but the fragile trust between uneasy allies. In the early months of 1944, the war had reached a fever pitch. The Allies were pounding German industry from the air. London's skies swarmed with bombers each night, bound for the factories and cities that fueled Hitler's war. But there was a problem. Germany was vast, its eastern lands beyond the reach of most Allied aircraft. No matter how many sorties were flown from Britain, whole sections of the Nazi war machine remained untouched. In Washington and London, planners searched for a way to close the gap. And then someone proposed the unthinkable. What if the bombers didn't come home? What if they flew east instead, past the target, past the battle lines, and landed in Soviet territory? It was a bold idea, and a dangerous one. The Soviets had kept their lands sealed to Western air forces for years. Even as allies, their cooperation was cautious, their intentions hidden behind the Iron Curtain that was already beginning to descend. But the logic was irresistible. From Soviet soil, the bombers could strike the heart of the German front from behind. They could hammer the railways feeding the Eastern Front. They could hit oil, factories, and airfields that had never before felt Allied bombs. And so, in secret, talks began. In April 1944, American officers crossed into Moscow. They met with Soviet officials in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and suspicion. Every map unrolled across the table was studied by men who smiled without warmth. But Stalin, ever pragmatic, saw advantage. If American bombers could help crush German strength on his front, it meant fewer Soviet lives lost. He agreed, reluctantly, conditionally, and entirely on his terms. 3 Soviet airfields were selected: Poltava, Mirgorod, and Pyatyn. Quiet Ukrainian towns now turned into forward bases for the United States Air Forces. Crews of engineers and supply officers arrived first, working alongside Red Army labor battalions to carve out the runways. The sight was surreal. American airmen under the Soviet flag building airfields in a land few Westerners had ever seen. In England, word spread among the bomber crews. The mission was voluntary, top secret, and dangerous. Those who signed up were told little beyond one fact: they might not be coming back the same way. On June 2nd, 1944, the first mission took off. It was only days before the D-Day invasion. The sky above England roared with the sound of more than 100 B-17 Flying Fortresses and their P-51 Mustang escorts. Their target was the railway yards of Debrecen, Hungary, a key supply line feeding German divisions fighting the Red Army. After dropping their bombs, instead of turning back toward the English Channel, they turned east. For hours they flew over hostile skies, over occupied Poland, over battle lines traced in smoke, over a continent aflame. When they finally crossed into Soviet airspace, they expected flak or even interception, but the skies were silent. Below them stretched the endless green plains of Ukraine, and then the fields of Poltava came into view. As the bombers touched down, Soviet soldiers lined the runways, watching in awe. To them, the flying fortresses were monstrous machines, gleaming, powerful, alien. Red stars met white stars, handshakes were exchanged, photographs taken. Smiles, cautious but genuine. For a brief, shining moment, the alliance seemed real. The Americans were treated as guests of honor. Banquets were held, vodka flowed, toasts were made to Roosevelt, to Stalin, to victory. But behind the warmth, there were cracks. Soviet security was tight. American officers were watched everywhere they went.
The NKVD made it clear: no wandering, no photographs beyond the base, no curiosity. Friendship, but at a distance. Still, the shuttle raids continued. From the Soviet bases, the bombers took off again, striking targets in Romania and Poland before flying south to bases in Italy. There, they refueled, rearmed, and returned west. Each mission linked 3 nations across the skies, a chain of cooperation built on necessity and fragile trust. Then came the night of June 21st, 1944. The night Poltava burned. The Americans had just returned from a raid against German targets and were resting, confident they were deep behind friendly lines. But high above, unseen by Allied radar, a high-altitude German reconnaissance plane was already circling. It photographed every runway, every parked bomber, every fuel dump. That night, the Luftwaffe struck back. Wave after wave of German bombers descended on Poltava. The first bombs found their mark. Explosions ripped through the airfield. Fuel tanks erupted in pillars of fire that lit the sky for miles. The mighty flying fortresses burned where they stood, caught on the ground, helpless. American crews ran for cover as the night became an inferno. Soviet anti-aircraft guns barked, but too late, too scattered. The coordination that had seemed possible days earlier now fell apart in chaos and confusion. By dawn, the airfield was a graveyard. 43 B-17s destroyed, hundreds of tons of fuel and bombs gone. The smell of smoke and melted metal hung over the fields of Poltava. The loss was devastating. It wasn't just the planes, it was the dream. Operation Frantic had been meant to prove that 2 great powers could fight as one. Instead, it revealed how far apart they truly were. The Soviets blamed the Americans for not dispersing their aircraft. The Americans blamed Soviet command for the lack of defense. Trust evaporated in the ashes. Yet the missions continued, though fewer now and more cautiously. The bombers flew from Italy to the Soviet Union, striking targets in Eastern Europe and then back to Britain. But each flight felt colder, each welcome more formal. What had begun as an experiment in cooperation was becoming an uncomfortable necessity. As summer turned to autumn, the Red Army surged westward. The need for shuttle raids diminished. The Soviets, increasingly secretive about their territorial advances, began to restrict American movements. Fuel deliveries slowed. Requests for reconnaissance missions were denied. The walls were closing in. By the end of 1944, Operation Frantic was effectively over. The bases at Poltava, Mirogord, and Piryatyn were abandoned. American personnel withdrew, leaving behind only wreckage and silence. The sky bridge between Allies collapsed as quickly as it had risen. But its legacy remained. For those who flew those missions, the memory of crossing enemy skies into the unknown would never fade. They had seen 2 worlds meet in the clouds, the democratic West and the communist East, for a fleeting moment of shared purpose before history drove them apart. Operation Frantic was more than a military experiment. It was a glimpse of the uneasy future that would follow victory. The Cold War, in a sense, began on those runways, in the watchful eyes, the guarded smiles, the misunderstandings masked by ceremony. And yet, beneath the politics, there was something purer. The airmen who flew those missions cared little for ideology. They cared for survival, for duty, for the hope that each flight might bring the war closer to its end. To them, the vast skies over Europe were not about diplomacy, but about endurance and courage.
Today, few remember the shuttle raids. They're overshadowed by Normandy, by the Pacific, by Berlin. But for a few months in 1944, the skies above Eastern Europe carried the wings of 2 nations that would soon face each other not as allies, but as rivals. The wind over Poltava has long since gone quiet. The runways are cracked, the hangars empty. Yet if you stand there on a summer evening, when the clouds burn gold in the setting sun,
You can almost hear it, the distant echo of engines, the ghostly thunder of bombers that once bridged continents, and the whisper of a promise that never quite took flight. Operation Frantic, the mission that tried to unite the sky and showed how divided the Earth already was. They say war makes strange allies, but in 1944 none were stranger than the Americans and the Soviets, bound by necessity, separated by ideology, and now tied together by a sky route few believed could last. After the inferno at Poltava, the surviving crews gathered among the wreckage, blackened engines, twisted wings, bomb craters still smoking. The smell of aviation fuel hung in the air. American engineers walked silently among the remains of their aircraft, counting what was left and what was gone forever. The Soviets helped, but quietly. Their officers took notes. Their soldiers guarded the perimeter. No one said much. In the uneasy stillness of the next morning, both sides understood what had happened. The Luftwaffe had struck with precision because it had known. Someone, somewhere, had leaked the information. Whispers spread among the Americans that the Germans had somehow been tipped off, that Soviet security had failed, or worse, but officially no one dared to accuse. The alliance was fragile, and politics came before truth. Colonel Archie Old, commander of the American detachment at Poltava, stood in the ruins of his base and made a silent promise. The mission would go on. The men had come too far to let the operation die in smoke. And so it continued. The next shuttle raids were smaller, tighter, and far more cautious. Bombers from Italy flew to Soviet airfields, struck enemy supply lines in Hungary and Poland, then returned to Italy or England. The concept still worked, in theory. But the trust had been scorched, along with the runways.
The Soviets began limiting access. Every American move was shadowed by NKVD guards. Film cameras were confiscated. Maps had to be handed over after each briefing. Even casual talk with Soviet personnel became forbidden. Still, the Americans tried to build friendship. In Poltava and Mirgorod, they set up baseball games, shared chocolate, and invited Soviet officers to see their planes. The Russians were fascinated by the technology, the Norden bomb sight, the power of the B-17 engines, the guns that bristled from every side. But their curiosity was also suspicion. Behind the smiles, they were studying, learning, memorizing. One American pilot, Lieutenant Jack Red Wilson, later wrote in his diary, "They toast you with vodka at dinner, but you feel like you're being measured with every sip." Even so, there were moments of warmth. When a bomber crash-landed near Piryatin after a mission, local villagers ran across the fields to help. A Soviet nurse named Tatiana treated the wounded crew with quiet care. For days, she stayed by their side, translating, tending to their burns, and even teaching them a few words of Russian. When the men left, she waved from the field until their plane disappeared into the sky. None of them ever saw her again. But not all encounters were so gentle. The Americans discovered that Soviet command refused to allow them to fly reconnaissance over certain areas. Their requests for weather data were often ignored or delayed. Supplies from the U.S. took weeks to arrive, often diverted or misplaced. When the Americans complained, they were met with silence or stiff politeness. The message was clear: you are guests, not equals. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe wasn't finished. In late July 1944, German bombers returned, this time striking Mirgorod. The damage wasn't as severe as Poltava, but the lesson was the same. No matter how far east the bombers flew, the enemy's reach was longer still.
And yet, despite the danger, morale among the crews remained strangely high. There was something intoxicating about these missions,
the sense of flying into the unknown, of bridging worlds. The men felt like pioneers, explorers of the air war's last frontier. When they flew eastward, across Poland and into Soviet airspace, the landscape transformed beneath them: forests, rivers, fields, endless horizons. To the young men in the cockpits, it felt like flying off the edge of the map. At Poltava, they slept in tents near the runways. At night, they listened to distant thunder, sometimes storms, sometimes artillery far to the west. The Red Army was advancing, pushing the Germans back toward the Vistula. Every day the front crept closer, and the bombers' missions became more daring. They struck rail junctions at Lwów, oil fields in Romania, supply depots near Minsk. Each mission was a hammer blow in a larger symphony of destruction. But something had changed. The Americans were no longer just fighting the Germans. They were navigating a diplomatic battlefield, one far more subtle and treacherous. Orders began arriving from Moscow restricting American movements. Requests for fighter escorts were delayed. One mission was canceled entirely when Soviet Air Command refused to grant clearance. Frustration grew. Colonel Old sent reports back to England, warning that Soviet cooperation was increasingly limited. Washington and London read his words carefully. Roosevelt still needed Stalin's goodwill for the final push toward Berlin. Officially, nothing was said. Unofficially, the operation was dying. By September, the last shuttle raids were underway. On the morning of the final mission, the air at Poltava was cool and heavy with dew. Ground crews moved among the bombers, checking engines, loading bombs. The men went through their rituals: photographs of sweethearts tucked into flight jackets, lucky charms rubbed for luck.
When the engines roared to life, the sound rolled across the Ukrainian plains like thunder. The final raid struck targets in eastern Germany, one last punch before the curtain fell. As the bombers lifted off, Soviet soldiers stood at attention. Some waved, some didn't. The American flags painted on the fuselages glinted in the morning light, stars over the land of the hammer and sickle. When they returned from the mission, there were no more celebrations, no more toasts. Orders came down quietly, prepared to leave. The shuttle bases would be closed. The Americans packed their gear, their flags, and their unease. As the last C-47 transport lifted off from Poltava, an eerie silence settled over the airfield. The wind swept through the empty hangars, whispering over the scars of bomb craters that still pocked the earth. Operation Frantic was over. What had begun as an experiment in unity had ended as a lesson in mistrust. The Soviets, wary of Western presence, erased most traces of the American stay. Buildings were repainted, signs removed. Within months, it was as if the U.S. airmen had never been there at all. Yet in the diaries and memories of those who flew, the operation lived on. They remembered the vastness of the Russian steppe, the strange mix of camaraderie and caution, the night the sky itself caught fire. Years later, historians would look back on Operation Frantic not just as a series of bombing raids, but as a glimpse into the future. A brief, flickering moment when allies met on the same ground before the Cold War turned that ground to ice. For the men who lived it, it was simpler than politics. It was about survival, about courage, about the will to keep flying through the unknown.
In their logbooks, the entries were terse, military, factual. Mission complete, targets destroyed, landed Poltava. But between those lines lay 1,000 unspoken thoughts, of friendship offered and withdrawn, of trust tested and broken, of the realization that wars may end, but the distances between nations do not always close. And so, Operation Frantic passed into history, a footnote to victory, a symbol of what might have been.
The sky remembers, though. The winds still whisper over the fields of Poltava, over Mirgorod and Peryabin. They carry the echoes of engines that once roared eastward into the dawn, the voices of men who believed for a moment that the sky could unite what the earth divided. Operation Frantic, the bridge between allies that collapsed under the weight of mistrust, yet still stands, in memory, as one of the war's strangest and most daring dreams. When the war ended, the names Poltava, Mirgorod, and Peryabin faded into silence. The runways that once echoed with the roar of flying fortresses grew over with weeds. The hangars stood empty, their walls scarred by fire and time. The Soviets kept their secrets. To them, Operation Frantic was a brief experiment, a chapter best forgotten. They rebuilt the airfields for their own use, stripped of every trace of the Americans who had lived and flown there. The stars and stripes were taken down, the vodka toasts ended, and the watchful eyes of the NKVD never blinked again. For the Americans who survived it, though the memories never left, they remembered the endless flights across occupied Europe, the thunder of flak bursting around them, the long, tense hours over the front lines. They remembered landing on Soviet soil for the first time, stepping out into a world that felt both friendly and foreign. And they remembered the night of fire, the Poltava raid, when the sky itself turned to flame and hope melted into the blackened wrecks of their bombers.
Years later, when the Cold War began, those men watched as the alliance they had risked their lives for turned into rivalry. The same airfields that once welcomed them would one day host Soviet bombers pointed at the West. The friendship that had flickered under the Ukrainian stars had been extinguished, replaced by the shadow of suspicion. But beneath the politics, something still endured, something quieter, truer. It was in the letters they wrote home, in the faded photographs of smiling Soviet soldiers standing beside American crews, in the journals stained with oil and sweat. They had built something, even if only for a moment, that no treaty or government could erase. They had flown where no one else had flown. They had trusted when trust was fragile. They had carried not just bombs, but the fragile hope that men might bridge their differences at 20,000 feet. Operation Frantic was a failure in strategy, but a triumph of spirit. It showed what courage looked like when it had to cross not just enemy lines, but the invisible borders of ideology. In the decades that followed, historians would debate its value. Was it worth the lives lost at Poltava? Did it change the course of the war? Maybe not, but in the vast, tangled story of World War II, Operation Frantic remains one of its most haunting and human episodes because for a few brief months, the skies above Europe belonged to everyone. Americans, Russians, British, all flying against a common enemy before history reminded them how different they truly were. Today, if you walk the fields near Poltava, you'll still find traces, shards of aluminum, rusted bolts, the ghosts of a forgotten airfield.